Awesome. Cool. Another month. Welcome to Buzzy Spaces event. We're happy you've joined us for another month. This month's topic, working in white spaces. And when we say white spaces, we mean predominantly white institutions, workplaces. And so we're excited to discuss this topic and learn with all of you with Breannah Conward-Lewis on finding the success in your career in these white spaces. So real quick bio, and then we'll get right into it. Breannah Conward-Lewis is a program manager. She's worked in areas such as HR, human resources, DEI, and workforce development. She holds a master's in corporate and organizational communications from Northeastern University. And she has also, where she has also worked and started off her career in the whole higher education field. And this is also where I cross paths with Bree. Bree's passion is shown in her work and commitment in the community, and she is perfect for this discussion. Bree, thank you for being here.
Of
How
course,
was that
yeah.
bio,
Thank you
by
for
the way?
having me. That was great. That was
Did I give
great.
you justice?
You did give me justice, except I did also do a concentration in HR management, but we don't have to talk about that.
Awesome. Well, missed that part. Maybe should have put your LinkedIn.
No, all good, Antonio. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. No, I really appreciate it. And so definitely had this in the plans to speak to you. So let me get right into it. So from your experience, what is the importance of having Black and Brown people on a team? And then a follow-up question, really using your HR hat, how can a company ensure that they achieve this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think when we think specifically about Black and Brown people, it's important that maybe we use the term BIPOC to kind of include all people of color, and, Black and Indigenous folks.
Mhm.
And there's so much importance in, having us at the table because it's not just, the way that we think, but it's also our experiences. The way that we maneuver this world and just the things that we experience kind of tie into our day to day work, and so we're able to bring a very specific lens to the things that are being done. And so it's important that in order to avoid, having to be a ginormous company that has to issue an apology
Mhm.
9 months down the road, you had folks at the table that could put up red lights and say, hey, that might not be, good for this certain demographic or for that certain demographic. Perfect example. I actually was looking at something on Google earlier, and
Mhm.
the artist, the singer Lizzo, had released a song and used the terminology spaz in it, and she ended up getting a lot of feedback from people saying that that's ableist. Spaz is a derogatory term. You shouldn't have that in your
Wow.
lyrics. And so there was a lot of just like frustration around that term being used in her song, and so pretty much she ended up removing it from her song and reproducing the song and putting it out without the word. But I saw comments kind of saying, all the people you work with, Lizzo, and no one could look at this and say, hey, you might want to reconsider because this could impact your audience. And so it's that same exact issue, I think, in the workforce, right? Like when you have people at the
Mhm.
table that are representative of all backgrounds, you're most likely going to mitigate those apologies that you'll have to send out later, or having things go out that could harm a community of people. And then you had asked the second part, I think with the HR lens. HR, the first thing I learned in my program, and the first thing people think of is
Mhm.
with HR, are the cops of the corporation. So the people that are there to protect
Mhm.
the corporation and not protect the the people of the organization. And similar to anything else, diversity has been looked at kind of as a formality. There's check boxes and things people have to do in order to ensure that they have X amount to fulfill a quota of
Mhm.
diversity. However, it's really sad in the way that it's dispersed, right? So they could fill a lot of diverse roles at the entry and mid-level, but then when you look at senior leadership and executives, there's not much of it. But from
Mhm.
an outsider's perspective looking in, you see 30% diversity and you're like, oh my god, that's amazing. And then you realize that that diversity is literally at the bottom of the career ladder. um
100%.
yeah, and so that's why thinking from my HR lens is that diversity is so much greater than what HR is able to deploy, because HR will always focus on the corporation and fulfilling, numbers and making sure that things look good. But it's up to each individual person
Mhm.
to want to, bring people of diverse backgrounds into their organization. And so as HR, we have to do a better job at getting folks on board with this, and making it clear as to why diversity is so important.
100%. I love that how you mentioned like once you start getting to senior positions, we don't see us anymore, right? And if we start seeing our our counterparts, our white counterparts that are being promoted,
Hmm.
that kind of doesn't sit well with us because it's like, wait, we've started the same time frame. I know we've talked about this a lot, and seeing promotions being passed up on us. Um, and another thing too, you kind of jumped the fence a little bit on being at the table. So I wanna get to that question because I think that's interesting because there are times where we are at the table, right? We had that seat,
Hmm.
but we don't know if we have the capacity to be able to speak up. So
Mm,
what are your suggestions for someone to be able to speak up in the workplace? And you mentioned brands and that always have to make these apologies, and I don't know if you think back to 2017, it felt like monthly or weekly, right? There was something new happening. The Heineken commercial, it's passing through Heineken Light and passing through all people of colors for a white person to then drink it. The
mm-hmm.
H&M kid that was wearing a sweater, right?
Yeah.
That
Hmm.
it was just there was a lot of things that happened that year and they continue to happen. So, what are your suggestions on how we can empower ourselves to speak up?
Yeah, I mean, that's real, right? I always think about when I used to work for the city of Boston. At our pool locations, we used to have first aid safety pool regulations. And one of the most of the flyers that were produced that year, it showed you examples of what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And all the kids in the photo that were doing the bad things just so happened to be black or brown. And all the kids that were doing the
Wow.
right things were white. And so when you think about things like that, right, naturally, I think we think of implicit bias, which is, code for racism. Racism as a term itself has evolved into unconscious bias and microaggression and all these things, but really what it comes down to is racism. And so therefore, because it's so systemic, a lot of times the people that are in these roles or feel like they're in a position where you would think they'd be able to say something are experiencing imposter syndrome. And
Hmm.
imposter syndrome is something that's very hard to combat because you don't necessarily know what the retaliation might look like if you say something that might not, sit well with the organization. And a lot of these organizations, I think, similar to our policing system, sorry to go so
Hmm.
deep, have been an establishment for a very, very long
Yeah.
time. And so these are systems that are so hard to break. And so I can come in as this like young, bright faced, like excited, ambitious person who's so intelligent. But at the same time, I know when I'm being minimized or when my words don't mean anything. There have been times when I've said something and no one heard me, but then my white colleague would say the exact same thing and it was
Hmm.
received. And so experiences like that, the more of them you have, the less likely you are to speak up. And so even though we're put in positions of power sometimes, we're still powerless because of the imposter syndrome that we face and the fear of retaliation.
Yeah, it gets tough to really fight right a truth that has existed for so long. So yeah, we've definitely been there in those situations. So talking about like finding that space. So
Mhm.
taking it specific to Buzzy, right? We have freelancers. They typically work for a short amount of time at a given company or for a given client. So for that short amount of time, connecting with other colleagues is super important. What are some things that you do specifically to try to find those spaces? And really specifically, if you're trying to identify those spaces on day one or first week at a new organization.
Yeah, I mean, life is all about finding your people, and these people can be anyone of any race, background, shade, whomever, but just people that support you, understand you, are going to challenge you, and truly want to see the world become a better place. And so, a lot of times in organizations specifically, you might look to ERGs. I know that's the first thing I do when I arrive at any
Mhm.
job. Well, now I look specifically to see, what employee resource groups exist and where can I find people of a similar demographic or a similar mindset with similar goals
Mhm.
that I can do, different, work with or different things with people that get me.
Mhm.
And I know that I'm really big on community. And so I always tend to look for people that do naturally look like me. I mean, to just keep it honest, we tend to flock to people that resonate most with us. And a lot of times we
True.
kind of decipher that based on how people look or how they appear. So I know that when I used to work at Northeastern, I specifically sought out other Black women, and we used to
Mhm.
have like Black girl magic lunches, and we'd come together during lunch and we'd eat and we'd fellowship. And it just felt really safe to know that we could talk about our experiences. But putting that HR hat back on, right? We
Mhm.
realized in that space that a lot of us were having the same experiences in our department. And so to an extent that starts to create some kind of um frustration with the organization. So I think they try to prevent us from coming together in those ways, but it's so
Yeah.
important, yeah, that we're intentional with finding our people.
Yeah, and I remember Northeastern, it felt like people of color were just spread out. Like there was this I don't know, conspiracy theory, right? That like we can't
Mhm.
work together. And so we would only
Yeah,
meet right monthly and it had to be during our lunch hour type of deal.
yeah,
So
we
if
were
you
few and
were
far between.
yeah, it's like, oh wow, where do you work? And it's like a whole other office, like two streets over.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, it's crazy because not everyone is lucky to have worked with someone like you. Because I remember our very first week, like you quickly jumped, like, all right, let me see where this guy stands. Where is he on the spectrum? Like, is he
Oh my god,
cool?
yes.
Is he cool or is he like on some coonery level
No,
type
for
of
real.
behavior? So I really appreciate that because learning from your example is one that I've been able to take with me. When we had a new colleague come in, I think right after you had left that office, when I started my new job in Charlotte too. It's funny because it was just me and another a black person, another person of color on my team. It's like, wow, he's the only one. So I had to go through the same experience. Like, all right, we're all gonna have a team lunch because it's like my first week. I'm gonna specifically be like, hey, can I carpool with you and like try to get some information from him, see where you stand. You know, it's like a test the wokeness scale, I guess.
Yeah, you gotta test it out. You cannot
So
jump in with 2 feet.
yeah, so I definitely think, and it's crazy that in workplaces we kind of do have to play this game, right? Like we can't just jump right in and speak our mind. We do have to test the waters with like a few ideas and see how will people react to it, right? Oh, no one heard, so I can't say that again. So I might have to say 10% of that until I can take it back to 100.
Mm.
Um, you talked about community, and I thought that was really interesting because that's definitely something that I've seen in you that you're always very engaged in the community, especially in Boston, because we know there's a lot of growth to be had in the city of Boston. How have you found and built community in just your work experiences?
So in my work experiences, I would say that typically, so I was born and raised in Boston, and so I still live here. And so having experiences growing up here as opposed to now being a professional here are completely different. And so
Mm-hmm.
entering the workforce, I would say, was the first time I started to understand the concept of transplant. So these are people that are from other states but moved to
Mm-hmm.
Boston specifically for work. And so thinking about building community and people of color that I see in my organizations, it's getting off of the work site and doing things locally, things in the
Mm-hmm.
city that make me feel like I'm kind of relearning Boston as a city, but I'm also engaging with folks that haven't seen the side of Boston from a local perspective. And so finding joy and like doing things that I may have already done, but doing them again now with like colleagues, and specifically, colleagues of color that like I connect with, that want to do things outside of the workplace. And so I feel like that's like monumental in like building community both in work and outside of work. But then also too, like I do have like just local organizations that I like to get involved with, especially organizations that are intentional about supporting and empowering
Mm-hmm.
our communities of color.
Yeah, and I remember, I don't know if you remember, so you can, because I would like for you to speak on this, because when we worked together, I don't know if you remember we did
The
um,
volunteering.
the volunteer work where you went to, what was it? It was, I
We
think it
went
was
to
a
the daily
grocery store,
table.
but
Yeah.
yeah, where they reused or resold, right, fruits or food
From
that,
Trader Joe's.
yeah, that they weren't selling. Could you speak to how you got that done? And I mean, just to skip to the end result, it was positive overall. Everyone enjoyed the experience, and it did bring some sort of camaraderie. And you were also the star of the day just because you put it together. Can you kind of speak to the work that you put in and how you got bought it buy-in from people to go?
Yeah, so not everyone went. Now that I remember, it's like
But a good majority went. I would
no, a
say
good majority did
70%.
go.
Yeah.
Exactly. I would definitely say 70%, but there were definitely folks, Antonio, that I wanted to be there
I want to
that
focus on the
didn't go.
positive.
No, yes, yes, yes. Okay. Very true. Anyway, so basically, going back to this whole idea, or not idea, but like me talking about being born and raised in Boston, people have a very narrow perspective on what Boston is, and depending on where you work in very,
Mhm,
um, very normal, not normal, what's the word I'm looking for? Like areas of Boston in which people feel the most comfortable and the most safe. And people have a lot of ideas about
mhm.
other parts of Boston.
Yeah.
And
So like the
so
Beacon Hills,
the Beacon Hills, the Faneuil
yeah, Mission Hill.
Halls,
Yeah.
Mission
Yeah.
Hill, which has a long history on its own. So it's interesting
Hmm.
too the way that the mindset has been reshifted to these spaces and areas. But anyway, I digress.
Hmm.
Um, I'm really big on volunteering. So if I have time, I will always find a way to give back. Time is just as valuable as money. And so I always try to, volunteer and give back. And so I really wanted to do something like that at Northeastern specifically because I wanted people to get out of our Northeastern bubble, which is like actual terminology, right? And see that there's more to Boston than just where we were. And so I was very intentional about finding an organization that I knew could really benefit from having us during those specific hours, and something that I felt would be a stretch for my colleagues to go to, because I knew that it'd be a completely different
Hmm.
view or scenery. It'd be like a totally different experience. You'd be around different people and really see, what people in that specific area are living like. And
Hmm.
so I had organized it and pretty much brought it to the approach of volunteering. I think people are always going to feel compelled to give back, whether they want to or not, because sometimes it's not always intrinsic, right? It's extrinsic too.
Hmm.
And so, like, really playing on the idea of volunteering, I think really bought buy-in. And then if I recall, they were going to do like an article or something in like the Northeastern, whatever, that would like also
Oh, I
help
didn't
talk
know that
about,
part.
yeah, that would also help talk about what we were doing. So yeah, it definitely created buy-in. Are you am I frozen?
Yeah, but I hear you.
Um,
So okay, yeah, and I remember and I really just thinking back of that, I think there's a lesson in that like you could create that sort of community. I mean, it's hard, right? I mean, it takes a lot of work to do it, but you can do it, right? And find something that everyone will sign up for. And yeah, people put in work that day for the most part, right? I mean, it was a few hours, but
yeah.
it did bring people together. And I love what you said, getting people to view more of the city. Most were transplants. I think to be honest, I think you were the only or one of two that were truly Boston like natives, like born and raised. Because even
Hmm.
myself, I'm like 40 minutes south, right? A whole different like part of Massachusetts.
Right,
Um,
exactly.
yeah. So getting back to HR terms now, right? But
Hmm.
along the same lines, how have you advocated um, for creating those communities? Specifically, it could be ERGs, which I feel has been like a buzzword in the last like 3 or 4 years, right? Having these
Hmm.
employee resource groups. How have you advocated or been a part of kind of these initiatives?
Yeah, so I feel really fortunate that my work has always primarily, especially since leaving higher education,
Mhm.
have been primarily focused on, excuse me, have been
Bless you.
primarily focused on, just gonna drink some water. Have been, sorry about that, primarily focused on economic mobility. And so when we think about economic mobility, a lot of times we have to start from the framework of social determinants of health. So we think about all the things that are impacting people's ability to live a fulfilling life. And so one of the primary things to that is employment and being able to make money. And so naturally, I've been in positions where I've been able to support with employment, but then
Mhm.
from that rate, I'm always thinking about growth. So doing different training and development to help people grow in their career so they can make more money and climb the ladder. The goal is to get more people from BIPOC backgrounds into these leadership roles. Granted, there are people in who identify within BIPOC that are overly represented in specific roles or higher careers where you make a lot more money.
Mhm.
But however, my intentions are always to focus on the BIPOC community.
Awesome. That's great because I mean, I think we're seeing that in tech. So there's some tech companies that are starting to focus on like just focus on high school kids like at that level, or maybe
Hmm.
kids that didn't finish college, be able to train them in certain tech skills so that they can join the workforce in some sense. But then I think the key thing is what you mentioned is how do we get them to leadership positions? I
Right.
remember the my last employer, it was like they always spoke about these great diversity numbers, but as you mentioned, they're all populated in a certain department. Like the majority were in the call center, so it was like if you remove them, well, we have no diversity.
Hmm.
But I mean, of course, it took the events of 2020 for people to wake up, and now ERGs are becoming a thing in many organizations. So something came out of it. At least a start came out of that. Um,
Right.
and so, thinking of thinking of that lack of representation, right, in the workplace. And this is a hard one. How do you advise people to acknowledge the fact that there is a lack of representation in the workplace? Where do you start? How do you do this without sounding like you're being too aggressive, or how to, I guess, trying to remove yourself and trying to get trying to create some impact out of this issue that you're seeing in the workplace?
Yeah. That's a really good question because the reality is the approach that I know a lot of us want to take will get us nowhere. And an example actually came up today at work when we think about the Will Smith Chris Rock situation, which was talked about forever. And I know it's totally controversial. However, it
Is
is
it?
well, it's been so controversial because people have so many opinions about it. But the reality is, I'm putting this on record, the
The man's
reality
got slapped.
is, yeah, I mean, the reality is he got slapped, punched, whatever, but who is facing the grunt of the repercussions from that?
Jada.
Antonio, who was the person that did the punching?
Will Smith.
Exactly. Now
I
his intentions might have been pure. It's, keep my wife's name out of your mouth and don't talk about us.
mean,
But
that's what he
his
said. Yeah.
actions and the way he went about doing it is going to get him essentially punished. And so, time and place for everything, right? So when we think about how upsetting these workplaces can make us, I know for me personally, I was so livid, especially at my previous role, that I messaged the chief human resource officer directly. I sent her an email. My email was saying, can you please release some metrics around the amount of people of color
Mm,
that you have in leadership roles? It's important that you're transparent so that way we can see and understand that you have our best interest and that you want to see us grow into that level. And so this was basically my email verbatim. And then I get a
mhm.
response back saying, oh, you should speak with the DEI team if you have questions about that. So that's really frustrating. And at my current
Yeah.
company, my chief human resource officer now, whom I report to, is very big that everybody at our company is a CDO. Everybody at our company is a chief diversity officer. We do not
That's
have a
awesome.
chief diversity officer because when you have one person in a role that big, they're supposed to be entirely responsible for DEI across our system, when in reality, everyone needs to play a role, like I said previously. So I say all that to say, organizing is key, and
Mhm.
organizing might not be like stepping into the office and saying like, hey, this needs to change, but it's sharing your experiences with people that are also having those same experiences, because together you can really think through what is the best approach to solving this. I know there's folks that work at my company now who are completely outraged with the number or lack thereof of BIPOC
Mhm.
representation in leadership roles, but because I, share that frustration, but I have a little bit more experience, I'm able to talk through more solutions with them. So I think the first solution always is going to be organize and try to, stay in close contact with folks that are facing similar things as you, because eventually you might make yourself feel like you're crazy. I think
Mhm.
that's the goal, is they want us to think that we're crazy, that we're making this up, and that our experiences are not real. And so it's important to get that validation from other people who get it. So organizing is key. Another solution too is thinking through, like, what's next for you. Honestly, every company is able to offer you something entirely different, and if you're at a company that's not delivering in the ways you expect them to, make your exit plan and leave. I will
Mhm.
never encourage someone to stay and try to change an organization, because the reality is the organization will change you way faster than you have the
It's a
ability to change that
huge feat.
organization. Yeah,
100%.
and it's very, very true. And I mean, Antonio, you saw the difference in like me as a person being where we were. Like I was
Mhm.
completely like beaten down in a sense. And I knew that even if the promotion came eventually, I was still not going to be happy because at the end of the day, the organization did not have the ability nor the desire to change. So yeah, those
I
are
think
my
I
two
lost
big
you.
takeaways is organize and try to
Okay.
facilitate change. Oh, hello.
We're back. We're back.
Yeah, so those are my two big takeaways is organize and see what change you can make internally as a group. And if change is not happening, make your exit strategy and leave.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I asked the question specifically because I know you've been through this time and again. I think if I ever had advice on how to I bring this up to a manager or a colleague or something, you're definitely the go-to for this.
I
Just because
got y'all. I got y'all.
you know
All
how
of
to
you.
put it in words where like I'm angry typing and shit, but like this sounds cordial.
Make it you know what? I would definitely always recommend the book to folks. It's called Eloquent Rage by
Okay.
Professor Brittany Cooper. And it's an amazing book because I think that's exactly the best terminology is eloquent rage, right? Be outraged,
Mhm.
but always try to keep it eloquent.
Perfect. Perfect. So yeah, any other resources that you would recommend for people to read, follow, to get better educated on really how do you better advocate for yourself, and better advocate ultimately for others?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. There's a lot of different resources and things that I'd recommend. For
Mhm.
starters, definitely thinking about eloquent rage. And I can only really speak from the perspective of a Black woman because a lot of the books and the things that I look to are for Black women because the reality is like what I go through is always going to be different than any
Mhm.
other person of any race or gender. And so for Black women that might be tuning in, eloquent rage. Also, A Seat at the Table is another really good book by Minda Harts, which is amazing and something to keep in mind because I think a lot of times too. Black women, we try to go to work, keep our head down, do our job, and leave, and fail to realize that in those like after work socials or in those other times outside the office, those are when promotions are happening, where conversations are taking place that we want to be privy to,
Mhm.
but we're so gun-ho on like just going to work, doing our job and leaving that we might miss those opportunities. But how do we get our voices heard and stay at the table? Another thing too is not necessarily a concrete resource, but self-care is so important, making sure that you're pouring into yourself wholeheartedly, so that way you have the energy and the ability to deal with the realities of our world. The world is going to change at a very, very, very slow pace, and we're going to continuously be beat down by the world. And I encourage people to take all the time they need to focus on themselves. Oh, and use your PTO, take time off, do what you got to do, recharge, like, please.
100%.
So yeah, I could probably go on with a list of books, essays,
No, those are
articles, all that
great.
stuff.
And
But yeah,
just
start there, y'all.
the last point, I love the last point because it's not like a particular resource, but it's something you should seek out. And I remember, I think you were one of the first people that I've ever heard talk about like, oh, I went to see a therapist, and I was just like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I mean, you planted the seed so that later on, I think I reached out to you directly, like, where do I find one, right? And it's been great ever since, going like I think 16 months strong with the same person. So
Love
that's
that.
definitely thanks to you, and definitely that's a great piece of advice. Awesome, Bree. Anything you wish I asked you of you? Like any final thoughts?
No, not really. I just encourage everyone to continue having these conversations, continue speaking up, always try to be an ally, especially in times where you notice that your colleagues of color or just people of color around you are exhausted, and tired of teaching. It's your turn to speak up and speak out.
100%. Yeah, those I look back at the times of like those 10, 15 minute rants that we could have, shut the door in an office and just right talk shit. And it's like, okay, nothing happened out of this, but I feel better just being able to speak to it and being heard. So for sure.
Exactly. Oh, and the last thing I was gonna say, because now that you say that, having those
Yeah.
meetings and closing the door, there was definitely a specific time, I would say, which was like my biggest learning opportunity, was when one of our colleagues made a comment that was like microaggressive and like really frustrating to me because it was definitely racist. And so I went to have a conversation with that colleague and she like freaked out and she looked terrified, like I was gonna like kill her or attack her. And the reality is I just really wanted it to be a teachable moment.
Yeah.
So from there, what I realized is that everyone's not going to want to listen to what you have to say, even if it is something that could really change their perspective. But don't ever give up trying, whether that means just, I ended up sending this colleague an email with a bunch of like resources and articles that they could
Mhm.
read to understand why what they said wasn't okay. And regardless of whether she wanted to talk to me face to face or not, I know she saw that email. So I say all that to say, always like try not to fear educating if possible, if that means sending an email. Or what I would also do, sorry, I know I'm speaking too much, but what I would
Nah, keep
also
going.
do, what I also did, I don't know if you remember, is I would have DEI come in and teach workshops.
I do
And it
remember
was
that.
never,
We
yeah,
had
it
one
was
like
never
every 6 months
targeted.
or so.
Exactly. And it was never targeted at one specific person, but we all know the people that needed that more than others. And so if you need to call the DEI team at your job and have them come in and teach, that's what they're there for. That's what they should be doing. So if you've had like racist encounters with people, call DEI, and whether that person's going to listen or not, they have to sit
Mhm.
through that training. So don't be afraid to seek out external support and help with everything going on.
Awesome. Yeah,
I'm
I love
done.
that because you won't, your director or your boss, your head boss will never say no to, right? Let's do diversity training. Like they have to say, like, you put them in an awkward position, like, you already have it set up. Let's do it.
They're
Yeah.
like, yeah, we would love that. Oh my God, let's do it.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love that. I love your tenacity and just you're always trying to just educate others. And I love your advice. Try as much as you can, and when it gets exhausting, leave before it beats you up. Thank you, Bree. This felt like any other phone conversation, right?
Yeah, I could talk about this
Yeah.
all day.
All
Call
right.
me when
We'll,
this
we'll
ends.
we'll bring you back. We'll definitely. There's so many topics that we can touch on. So thank you, Bree. Thank you for your time.
Of
Really appreciate you
course.
for this. Everyone on the call, thank you. Thank you for joining us for the spaces, and we'll catch up with you next month. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.